Imagine the first day on a new job, and it's just starting to get light outside the window. An elderly teacher who has given his life to education is walking down the school corridor, preparing to meet his class. But what was supposed to be the beginning of a new chapter has turned into a nightmare. In the classroom, right in front of the other students, a group of racist teenagers pounced on him with fists. Friends, before we dive into this story, tell us about yourself. What's your name and where are you watching this video from? We're always curious to know who's with us and where you're from. Your comments and support really mean a lot to us. Every one of your likes, every one of your opinions helps promote our channel, so that important topics like this are seen and heard by as many people as possible. Remember, you are not just the audience, you are our community, the ones we work hard for. We are grateful to each and every one of you for your attention and participation. Listen carefully, because this story is more than just a story. It's something that touches us all. Enjoy the show. His name was James Henderson, and he had over 40 years of teaching experience. James was over 65. His once black hair long grayed, and his face covered with wrinkles that told the story of his years in the classroom. He had come a long way as a teacher and a man who could see the potential in every student, even if others didn't see it. James was tall and a little stooped. His steps were slow and measured, but his every step spoke of dignity and fortitude. His brown skin and calm, deep voice were soothing and trustworthy. He always wore neatly ironed shirts, often in pale colors, and dark jackets. Even if they looked a little worn, he had a pair of kind but slightly sad eyes, the eyes of a man who had seen both good and bad, but who always believed in the possibility of change. For James, school was a second home. He taught all his life in disadvantaged neighborhoods, where he often encountered difficult children and challenging life circumstances. But every time he remained true to his goal of educating and helping. He was loved not for his strict rules, but for his patience and genuine kindness. Over the years, James educated more than one generation of students, and many of them thank him for helping them believe in themselves and choose the right path. When James was offered a place at a new school, he took it as a chance to feel needed again. After a brief hiatus due to health problems, he was glad to get back to teaching. The new school, Willow Creek Middle School, seemed peaceful, and he saw it as a place where he could pass on his experience. He hoped that this job would be a new page for him, and his knowledge and ability to relate to children could be useful again. On the drive to Willow Creek, James was going over plans and ideas for the first lessons in his head, thinking about how to get to know the students, gain their trust and interest. He wanted to convey something important to the children so that they could understand the value of education and the pursuit of a better future. In this respect, he had enough ambition. He always wanted children to see the world more broadly and learn to understand how important every person is, regardless of appearance or background. James arrived at the school early in the morning. When the hallways were still empty, Willow Creek greeted him with emptiness and silence, broken only by the occasional footsteps of other teachers hurrying to their classrooms. He looked around the building, studying his surroundings, feeling a slight excitement and anticipation of meeting his new students. Inwardly, James hoped that within these walls, he would once again be able to create that special atmosphere of trust and respect that he had always tried to bring to his classes. But he had no idea that behind those quiet walls, not an inspiring atmosphere awaited him, but something much darker and more dangerous. The next morning, James Henderson woke up a little earlier than usual. He knew that today was his first day at his new school, and he wanted to prepare himself thoroughly. His room was quiet, and the light of the morning sun streamed through the small window, filling the space with a soft glow. James sat down at his desk, carefully laying out his old but favorite study materials that he had collected and honed over the years. They were his most valuable tools: outlines, stories, books with underlying quotes and notes in the margins. In his hands was a worn folder with sheets of paper scrawled with notes on how to engage children, how to make stories in books vivid and memorable, how to connect school subjects with real life. These notes and materials were his pride, the result of decades of experience and love for his work. He knew that children sometimes get bored in class, so he always tried to find creative ways to turn dry facts into exciting discoveries. His goal was simple. He wanted students not just to learn, but to really understand and feel what he was talking about. James chose stories about people who have overcome hardship, about the strength of spirit and the importance of compassion. These stories were meant to inspire the students, to show them that everyone can become stronger and wiser. Even if the path is not always easy, he thought he could combine several different topics in the first lesson to see what the children were interested in, how they reacted, what they agreed with, and what they challenged. He was certain knowledge is more than just books. He dreamed of showing the students that school was a place where they could find themselves. As he dressed, James looked at himself in the mirror and felt a warm thrill. He was wearing his favorite light shirt and an old brown jacket that always gave him confidence. His hands, trembling slightly with excitement, habitually straightened his shirt and buttoned the buttons. He mentally imagined the moment when he would enter the classroom, meet the eyes of the new students, and perhaps see in their eyes the interest and curiosity that he valued so much in his work. Before leaving, he took another look at his recorded thoughts for the first lessons. He made one last note in his notebook: gain trust first. That phrase was like a mantra for him. He knew that without trust and respect, there could be no real learning. Inside, James felt a warm, even slightly childlike anticipation of meeting the class. It was important to him that each student saw him not just as a teacher, but as someone who was ready to support and help them find their way to knowledge. When James left the house, he took his neatly packed notebooks, notes, and books with him. The drive to school didn't seem too long, and as he walked, thoughts of his upcoming classes filled him with joy. There was a firm assurance in his heart that he was back where he belonged, and that his knowledge and warmth would resonate. James walked into the classroom, feeling a familiar excitement. When he opened the door, the whole class frowned and stared at him. Down scenes of teenage eyes, cold and wary. For a moment it felt a heavy, almost ominous silence enveloped the room, as if this classroom existed outside of time, outside of the joyous and bright world outside the windows. He stepped forward, forcing himself to remain calm and smiling. But despite his years of experience, something in those looks alarmed him. Several teenagers Saturday in the front row, their faces expressing a barely concealed distaste. James had picked up on this atmosphere immediately. He had learned to sense the mood of an audience over decades of work, but he hadn't seen such an unpleasant, almost icy indifference to him as a teacher in a long time. "Good morning, class," he said, hoping his friendly tone would help create at least a small bridge between him and the students. But the response was silence again. Some of the boys grinned, and in another corner someone cast a hard, challenging glance at him. One of the older students, whose name was Tommy, a tall, sturdy boy with a sullen face, loudly leaned back in his chair, staring at the teacher. His eyes were full of defiant indifference, and that coldness made James feel uncomfortable. "My name is Mr. Anderson," James continued, trying to remain friendly. He tried to start the lesson with a simple request: "Tell me a little about yourself, and I'll tell you about me. We have this school year to spend together, so let's start getting acquainted." But his words were met with an even tenser silence. No one responded. Only one of the students, a frail-looking, sad-eyed boy named Michael, raised his hand hesitantly. But before he could say anything, Tommy grinned and gave him a scornful look, which made Michael drop his hand as if he feared the consequences. James noticed this and tried to support him with a glance, but Michael stubbornly stared at the table, as if hiding from the world. In the back row, a group of teenagers were talking, not paying any attention to the teacher. James caught a snippet of conversation, a low whisper that was filled with acerbic taunts and occasional derogatory words. Even his authority didn't seem to stop them. They were blatantly ignoring his presence. James' heart began to beat faster, and a slight shiver ran down his arms. He realized that this group of guys was not going to respect him. Their attitude was openly contemptuous, but there was something about the contempt that he found particularly disturbing, as if this wasn't just a juvenile confrontation, but something much deeper and more sinister. Through the silence came a low laugh, as if someone was just waiting to destroy everything he had hoped to create. James tried to start the lesson. As usual, with a simple conversation, he put a few key questions on the board to encourage the students to think, but a wave of silent glances and barely restrained chuckles rose in response to his attempts. At one point, someone from the back of the desk whispered deliberately loudly, "Why do we need an old man? He won't last a week in here." The class erupted in muffled laughter, and James felt the calm begin to leave him. He took a deep breath, trying to ignore the taunts, and continued the lesson, speaking with a confidence he himself barely felt. But the cold indifference he had noticed from the beginning was gradually being replaced by open hostility. Some students were now defiantly looking away, whispering and sneering, making no secret of the fact that they were discussing him. Several times James tried to gently get their attention by calling them by their first names, but it only made things worse. When he uttered, "Tommy, what do you think of that?" the guy didn't even look in his direction, just snorted contemptuously and muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "I don't think I give a damn about what some old prick who came here says." The words hit James like a slap in the face. The silence in the classroom was almost deafening, and for a few seconds no one moved. He gathered his will, trying to suppress the resentment that was building, and said, trying to remain calm, "Tommy, that's disrespectful. I'm here to help you, and I hope we can work together." But the answer to his words was only cold silence and mocking laughter. Tommy grinned and nodded to a couple of the other boys, and they exchanged understanding glances, as if they had agreed beforehand. Now their whispering had turned into open discussion. One of them, a stout guy named Jason, leaned over to Tommy and said rather loudly, "Did you hear that old bag from somewhere down south? Probably lived in a cabin and read books out of boredom." The laughter in the classroom grew louder. James felt his heartbeat begin to quicken. He realized that they looked at him as an outsider, that his experience, his years of education, meant nothing here. They only saw him as someone who deserved neither respect nor attention. Even more frank and hurtful remarks began to fly in his direction, as if they were deliberately trying to break him. At one point someone threw in, "Hey, maybe you really can't pull it off here. Old man, it's not like school is your retirement home." This rude invective provoked Homeric laughter, and James realized that the situation was getting out of control. Each new comment was like another blow, painful, demeaning, soaked with a hatred he hadn't expected to encounter within the school walls. As the lesson went on, the atmosphere in the classroom became more and more sinister. The usual teasing escalated into outright aggression, and James saw a group of teenagers sitting in the back rows overstepping their bounds by openly insulting him. Tommy, the leader of the group, stared at James with a sneer in his eyes, his mouth twisted into a smirk, and without lowering his voice, he threw in, "Did you know, old man, that here in Willow Creek, teachers like you haven't been here yet. I guess you ought to find someplace else. You know your own place." His words elicited a gloating laugh, and a few of the boys around him began to loudly chortle in agreement. James felt his muscles tense and tried to swallow the lump in his throat, but it didn't let his emotions get the better of him. Just looked at Tommy softly and calmly, hoping it would silence him. The gesture, however, only irritated him more. "What are you looking at, old man?" Jason, sitting next to Tommy, blurted out sharply, "You like everybody looking at you. Used to it. Oh, I guess you've been looked down on all your life." He said the last words with a venomous grin, and James noticed the other students in the back rows whispering and chuckling, nodding approvingly. A few girls from the front row, who had kept to themselves at first, now joined in the ridicule, chuckling and whispering, "What's the point of a teacher like that anyway? Can't such a one teach anything?" James felt surrounded. His confidence began to crumble slowly under these words, each one of which felt like a sharp knife, but he tried to hold on, reminding himself that he was a grown man and the people in front of him were just teenagers who didn't know what they were doing. At that moment, however, Tommy did something James could not have predicted. He said quietly but clearly so that everyone could hear, "Hey, why don't you really go back where you came from? We don't want people like you teaching us." There wasn't a shadow of doubt in his voice, and his words sounded like a punch that resonated among the others. They laughed and chattered, glaring at James with hatred and contempt. James felt a painful sense of humiliation wash over him. He stood in front of the class, trying to maintain at least an appearance of calm, but he realized that his words, his knowledge and experience meant nothing here. With each new insult, with each mocking glance in his direction, he felt his belief that it was possible to find common ground in any situation crumble. The class had finally turned into something alien and hostile, and James, trying to save face, realized that this wasn't just teenage behavior. This was real hatred, and it was purposefully coming down on him as someone they didn't think had a right to be here. James tried to continue the lesson, but the words stuck in his throat. Threats and taunts came from all directions, and he could feel the dark, dense tension building. The air in the classroom seemed to be heavy with hatred and contempt, and each new attack on him only added fuel to the silent but raging fire. Tommy looked at James again with an icy smirk and, without taking his eyes off of him, slowly rose from his seat. His movement was unhurried and confident, as if he was in complete control of the situation. The rest of the boys in his group, watching Tommy, rose as well, exchanging grim chuckles and short nods, as if they had talked it over among themselves long ago. They began to approach the teacher, unhurriedly but menacingly, like predators playing with prey. James took an involuntary step back, but there was only a wall behind him. His heart raced, and he realized he had no way out. The classroom felt like a cage, and he felt trapped, deprived of any chance to defend himself. Tommy walked up close, looking at James with cold disdain, and said loudly, "Did you think you could just come in here and that we would listen? That we would obey you?" There was outright mockery in his voice, and he spoke so that the whole class could hear him, as if he was trying to prove something to his classmates. The other team, Jason, shoved James sharply in the shoulder, and the latter, not expecting such a sudden movement, staggered but kept himself on his feet. "You're too old for this. Okay, maybe it's time for you to retire." Jason grinned, and the gesture elicited approving laughter from the others who stood behind him, watching the scene as if it were a performance. They surrounded him on all sides, and every new mocking look, every push, added to James's sense of helplessness. His old body no longer had the strength to fight back, and he knew it. Years of teaching had taught him patience, but in this moment it was his vulnerability. He stood before a group of teenagers, each of whom saw him not as a teacher but as a target for their anger and cruelty. One of them, nudging him once more, "Fu in, well, old man, where has your wisdom gone? Can you say anything else?" The words were caustic, with a sneer, and the shove was stronger than before. They were surrounding him closely now, and James could feel their sinister stares, their gloating sneers, waiting for a reaction. But James remained silent, trying to maintain at least a shadow of dignity. The teenagers weren't going to stop. Oh, they could feel his fear, see his powerlessness, and it only made them more angry. The classroom, which had been just a place to study, had now become an arena where a group of teenagers, fueled by their own cynicism and sense of impunity, struck time after time, not only physically, but mentally as well. James stood against the wall, surrounded by teenagers, and in that moment, he realized that they weren't going to stop. His attempts to maintain his dignity and composure in the eyes of these teenagers were just an excuse for more disdain. Tommy took a step forward and, with a defiant smirk, said, "What, old man, don't you have anything to say? Maybe you're not as smart as you pretend to be." Then, without waiting for an answer, slapped James sharply on the shoulder. James staggered, but tried to stay on his feet again, hoping it was just a crude joke, that it would end if he didn't answer. But the teams, spurred on by his silence, seemed to conspire. Now the shocks and blows were coming at him, hard and merciless blows, precisely calculated to hurt. Each thrust was stronger than the last, and James realized he couldn't resist the aggression. The other students sitting at their desks were silently watching what was happening. Some hid their eyes, afraid to get involved in what was happening, and some, on the contrary, watched the scene of violence with cold interest. One of the girls in the front desk covered her mouth with her hand, horrified at what was happening, but no one made a move to help James or stop his tormentors. Jason, one of the strongest in the group, grabbed James by the shirt and pushed him against the board so that his head hit the wall. Pain shot through him, and for a moment he felt dizzy. But even at that moment, the teenagers didn't stop. They laughed, their laughter full of malice and contempt. He was nothing to them, just a target, an object for a show of force. As if in some ominous rhythm, they continued to strike. Tommy swung again and hit James in the chest, then kicked him sharply in the side. James felt his breath catch, and he tried to raise his hand in a gesture of pleading, but his attempt was ignored. "You thought you could teach us?" Jason shouted, punching him in the face. Blood came from his nose, and James tried to cover himself with his hands. But the teenagers, as if anticipating his weakness, began to push even harder against him. In the background of these blows sounded humiliating and poisonous words. "Oh, geezer, outsider, worthless." Each word was a separate blow, As painful as the physical abuse, James couldn't defend himself, couldn't find a way out. He was hurting not only in body, but also in soul. An unbearable sense of humiliation overwhelmed him as he realized that his years of experience, his desire to help these children, meant nothing to them. It seemed to go on indefinitely as James, battered and devastated, lay on the floor. The teenagers, satiated with their brutality, retreated, leaving him lying alone in the middle of the classroom, surrounded by silent and indifferent stares. James was found lying on the floor of the classroom, beaten and barely conscious. For a moment, his consciousness seemed to black out, and he saw only vague images, the cold, mocking faces of the teenagers, the feeling of pain and helplessness. Teachers passing by the classroom found him and called an ambulance. While the medics gave him first aid, James remained silent, overwhelmed not so much by physical pain as by deep frustration and shock. His body was bruised, his head throbbed, and his ribs ached with every movement. But the pain in his soul, the resentment and humiliation were far worse. He couldn't believe that the children he wanted to teach and support had been so cruel and insensitive. James was taken to the hospital, where doctors diagnosed multiple bruises, a concussion, and a broken rib. Lying in his hospital bed, he stared at the ceiling for a long time, in complete silence, digesting what had happened. These children, for whose sake he had come out of a quiet life of retirement, for whom he had prepared lessons, invested so much labor and hope, had turned out to be completely indifferent to his good intentions. Moreover, they didn't just reject him, they deliberately hurt him, enjoying his helplessness. His hopes for a new chapter in teaching were now shattered. James remembered how confident and enthusiastic he had felt on his first day, how he had prepared for the lessons, thought about the topics, tried to find interesting and useful materials. And now that he was shattered both mentally and physically, he couldn't understand what could have provoked such aggression and hatred. Thoughts that he might not be able to return to the classroom again hurt him, but he was no less hurt by unanswered questions. How could children become so cruel? Where had he made a mistake? Each blow, each taunt left not only marks on his body, but wounds in his soul. He thought about the fact that he might never be able to forgive himself for this lesson, and he was even more afraid that he might never be able to forgive these teenagers. The news of the teacher's brutal beating spread through the school with lightning speed. Teachers who had seen James the day he arrived could not believe that this kind, experienced man, who had returned to teaching after many years, had been the victim of such terrible aggression. There was a tense silence and bewilderment in the teachers' lounge, where everyday matters were usually discussed. James's colleagues, some of whom had been teaching for years and thought they could handle any challenge from the students, now felt helpless and anxious, knowing that they, too, might find themselves in a similar situation. At the assembly called by the headmaster, the faces of the teachers expressed a whole range of emotions, from fear and compassion to anger. The vice principal, Mrs. Carter, tried to keep her composure, but it was obvious that her voice was shaking. She tried to outline what had happened, but her account was interrupted by exclamations of outrage and anxious questions. "How could this even happen within our walls?" exclaimed Mr. Roberts, a math teacher who knew James from their days working together at another school. He was shocked. "These are our students. What could cause them to hate us so much?" The administration and teachers couldn't find answers. The school principal, Mr. Lawrence, seemed lost. He realized that this incident went far beyond ordinary teenage bullying and required immediate and serious intervention. He knew that if the school did not respond properly, the credibility of the school with parents, students, and even the teaching staff would be undermined. The next morning, worried parents came to the school. They gathered in front of the principal's office, discussing what had happened and demanding explanations. Many parents were outraged. Some demanded punishment for those responsible, while others feared for the safety of their own children. "If they could do this to a teacher, what will they do to our children?" one mother asked worriedly. Many parents and teachers demanded immediate action. They could not accept the idea that the school where their children spent most of their time could be the site of such terrible cruelty. The school administration was faced with a tough decision. Punishing the guilty students was necessary, but the problem was deeper than that. It was a signal that something had gone wrong in the atmosphere of the school, that the educational work and culture of the school needed a serious overhaul. Meanwhile, the school director was summoned to the education department for a report, and he had to explain how this could have happened at all. He felt not only the indignation of teachers and parents, but also pressure from above. His position was in jeopardy, and he realized that if he did not take decisive action, he would lose the respect of the staff and the trust of the community. The situation created a tension that hovered in every corner of the school. No one could go on with their normal activities without being reminded of what had happened. An atmosphere of shock, fear, and judgment permeated all the classrooms and corridors, reminding everyone that they could no longer turn a blind eye to such problems. After a meeting with the teachers, the headmaster, Mr. Lawrence, realized that soft measures would not be enough. The situation required tough and decisive action to restore a sense of safety and trust in the school, and to show the students that such behavior would not go unpunished. The first step was to decide to suspend the guilty teens. Tommy, Jason, and 3 other students who participated in the beating were immediately suspended. The suspension allowed the school administration to buy time to conduct an internal investigation and coordinate with law enforcement. Parents of suspended students were called to the school, and each was informed of the consequences of their children's actions. For many parents, this was a heavy and unexpected blow. Some were shocked and embarrassed. Others were hostile, unwilling to admit their children's guilt. They argued, made excuses, and blamed the school for failing to properly connect with the teenagers. But the principal remained adamant. He informed them that such violence and overt racism would be dealt with in the strongest possible terms, and that, in addition to suspension, the school would cooperate with further investigation and referral to law enforcement. Moreover, the school authorities decided to consider expelling the main perpetrators, Tommy and Jason, as the instigators were to be expelled from the school altogether and placed on the list of students who had violated school rules and laws. The move was unprecedented for Willow Creek, but Mr. Lawrence knew that it was the only way to show the other students the seriousness of the situation. The school could no longer risk the safety of other students and the reputation of the educators. The school board supported the administration in this decision. At the meeting, it was decided that any racially or otherwise motivated violence would be unequivocally punished, not only by expulsion, but also by mandatory referral to the police for review. Realizing that the situation could have further repercussions, the principal contacted local law enforcement and provided them with full details of the incident, including witness statements and classroom videos of the teenagers' actions. The police launched an investigation, and parents of the students involved in the beating were informed that their children could be held criminally responsible for the assault. As part of the investigation, the youngsters had to appear before juvenile justice officials. For many parents, this was a serious challenge. Their children could now face consequences that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The school hoped that the harsh measures would serve as a lesson to all students and send a message that cruelty and hatred are not just teenage mistakes, but criminal acts with serious consequences. These measures split the school community. Some parents and students supported the administration's actions, believing that the punishment was fair. Others feared that such strict measures were too harsh and that the youth should have been re-educated before resorting to extreme measures. However, the principal and the school board realized that mercy and compromise could only exacerbate the problem. Decisions were made and the school frowned in anticipation of the next steps. These punishments symbolize not only the school's desire to protect its students and teachers, but also an important reminder to everyone: hate and cruelty, no matter what they are, will never go without consequences. After an official investigation, the case of the beating of teacher James Henderson went to trial. The families of the teens involved in the attack were summoned to court hearings, and each had to face the judge and the public. The local courtroom was full. Classmates, parents, teachers, and school board representatives came to see how justice would respond to this shocking story that has become a symbol of brutality and racism. In the courtroom, tension was in the air. The teenagers, recently full of bravado and confidence in their impunity, Saturday next to their lawyers, avoiding direct eye contact with the judge, the lawyers, and the audience. Their families, who had previously defended their children and accused the school of being too strict, were now forced to remain silent and listen to the details of the accusations. Every detail of the incident, every episode of the attack was voiced and discussed in great detail. And for the parents of the accused teenagers, it was an ordeal that shattered their previous perceptions of their children. James Henderson attended the hearing, sitting in the front rows. He looked depressed and tired, still in a painful and mentally exhausted state. As he listened to witness testimony and recounted details of the attack, he was taken back again and again to those terrible moments when he stood surrounded by teenagers, feeling their hatred and blows. Despite the pain, however, he was there for the sake of justice, for this case to be a lesson to all present. In the course of the proceedings, important details emerged. One of the teenagers, under pressure from the lawyer's questions, admitted that he and his friends often heard racist comments in the family and among friends, which shaped their attitudes towards people of other nationalities and colors. Other teenagers tried to justify themselves by saying that they didn't realize the seriousness of their actions, calling it a normal teenage rebellion, but their statements only underscored their inability to accept responsibility for their own behavior. Some of the teenagers tried to explain their aggression by wanting to prove their strength, but the judge shook his head gloomily as he listened to their excuses. The hearings lasted several weeks, and every new detail, every fact voiced in the courtroom only increased the atmosphere of condemnation and disappointment. The parents of the accused teenagers began to realize that consequences would be inevitable and that it was no longer possible to hide the reality under excuses. The judge, after listening carefully to all parties, reached a verdict. The main perpetrators, Tommy and Jason, were sentenced to mandatory community corrections and a rehabilitation program that included therapy and training to understand their actions and the harm they had caused. They were also banned from returning to Willow Creek School and forced to transfer to specialized educational institutions with programs for students with problematic behavior. The court also ordered the other participants in the attack to undergo correctional programs, and their families were required to participate in family training and prejudice programs. The judge added that their behavior could not be justified by mere youthful carelessness and emphasized that such aggression must be taken seriously by society. Parents had to recognize that their children had faced the real consequences of their actions. This case was a painful lesson, but also an opportunity for teenagers, their families, and society to look at the roots of hatred and to realize that every violent act leaves deep traces. Immediately after the trial, the story of James Henderson's beating was widely publicized. Local journalists initially covered the incident as just another case of school violence, but soon the incident went beyond local news and made national headlines. The public was stirred not only by the teenagers' brutality, but also by the racist overtones of the incident. The story of a school teacher who faced violence and hatred from students sparked a wave of outrage, pity, and reflection across the country. Social media was flooded with posts, discussions, and comments. People shared their opinions and their own stories, discussing the problem of racism and violence in the school environment. Many users wrote about their experiences in education, describing how incidents of aggression towards teachers and school staff have increased in recent years. The hashtags #JusticeForTeachers and Stop Hate spread online, and thousands of users supported James Henderson, expressing respect for his resilience and courage. People were outraged. How could a school system meant to educate and protect allow this to happen? Families of victims and their acquaintances also expressed their emotions. Some parents who learned of the incident were shocked and demanded explanations from their children's schools, wanting to ensure that their educational institutions remained safe and that teachers received adequate support and protection. Teachers' organizations and teachers' unions have issued official statements expressing support for James and calling for a review of school safety measures. In their statements, they emphasized the need to treat educators with respect and the importance of creating environments where teachers feel protected and valued. The national media interviewed James. His quiet, tired voice and sincere words that he had just wanted to do something useful touched the hearts of the audience. He spoke not so much about personal suffering, but rather that what had happened underscored the underlying problems at the heart of society. James hoped that the case would spark a dialogue about parenting, respect for human dignity, and the fight against intergenerational prejudice. The topic of teacher safety has become a hotly debated topic in educational circles. Educators and psychologists have called for a review of educational policies and stronger programs to prevent violence and discrimination. Discussions have begun about the need for schools to introduce additional support measures for teachers, such as regular training to deal with conflict students, and to tighten control over violence and hatred in the school environment. Some politicians, riding the wave of public outrage, have proposed changes in legislative measures to protect teachers. They insisted on the need to increase penalties for aggression against teachers and to introduce mandatory tolerance education courses into school curricula, teaching children from an early age to respect the diversity of cultures and values. Along with the wave of support for James, some people also raise painful questions about the social issues affecting teen parenting. Psychologists and sociologists discussed how home upbringing, environment, and media influence shape teenagers' aggressive and prejudiced attitudes. For many, this incident was a wake-up call. If even in school, a place where every child should be nurtured and educated, such negative phenomena are taking root, then urgent changes are needed. James Henderson's story stirred the community, causing many to reflect on how often issues of violence and racism are ignored in schools. She emphasized that respect for teachers is not just a school requirement, but an important value necessary to create a healthy and safe society. Prompted by widespread public outcry and parental demands, Willow Creek School was forced to make major policy changes. The administration realized that a single incident such as an assault on a teacher was enough to call into question not only the safety of students and teachers, but also the very values that the school was supposed to instill. Under pressure from the community, parents, and educators, the school began to rethink its approach to education aimed at fostering respect, tolerance, and a safe environment for all. The first step was the introduction of mandatory courses on tolerance and anti-discrimination policies for all students. These courses were conducted in an interactive form, so that teenagers could not just listen to lectures, but think about their behavior and values and realize the consequences of aggression and hatred. The courses raised the topics of respect for differences, overcoming stereotypes, and the importance of intercultural interaction. The programs were developed together with psychologists and educational specialists to make them understandable and close to teenagers. In parallel, additional training sessions were introduced for teachers on conflict management, recognizing early signs of aggression in adolescence and responding to potentially dangerous situations. These sessions were an opportunity for teachers to increase their awareness of the psychological aspects of student behavior, as well as to discuss with colleagues the difficulties they face in the classroom. It was important for teachers to understand how to build relationships with students based on trust and mutual respect in order to minimize the risk of such incidents recurring. The school also introduced a new format of parent meetings where parents discussed not only children's academic performance, but also their social behavior and interaction with classmates and teachers. The school administration developed a parental involvement program aimed at discussing family values and learning how to promote tolerance and respect at home. Parents were encouraged to think about how their own attitudes and behaviors can affect their children and how important it is to set a positive example. In addition, under pressure from the school board and the community, the administration decided to impose stricter penalties for violence and discrimination. Now, every serious violation of school policy involving aggression, racism, or bias resulted in immediate suspension and mandatory discussion with parents and school psychologists. In particularly severe cases, students could be transferred to specialized educational institutions, sending a message to others that the school would not tolerate cruelty and hatred. In addition, the school introduced new forms of interaction between pupils and administration. Open discussions and roundtables were organized on a regular basis, where students could discuss their questions and problems. This gave adolescents the opportunity to be heard and to learn from peers and teachers about the importance of respect and mutual understanding. These changes were not a quick and easy solution, but step by step they began to change the atmosphere in the school. Students were taught that everyone, regardless of color, age, or social status deserved respect. Administrators, teachers, and parents hoped that the new approach to education and the increased emphasis on human values would help restore trust and safety within the school walls and prepare students for life in a more respectful and tolerant society. The story of James Henderson and the Willow Creek teenagers was a painful lesson for the school and the community, forcing many to rethink their attitudes and reflect on the root causes of cruelty, racism, and indifference. It showed the terrible consequences of a lack of respect, indifference to prejudice, and a belief in impunity. There was increasing talk in society of the need to foster a culture of empathy and mutual respect from an early age. This meant not just demanding obedience, but also teaching adolescents to recognize the value of human life and to understand and respect others, regardless of their appearance, age, or background. Education, first and foremost, was to be a process where, along with academic knowledge, students learned lessons in tolerance and responsibility. James Henderson's story is a reminder that prejudice and cruelty are not just stages of adolescent rebellion that will go away on their own. They are rooted deeper, fed by fears, ignorance, and environmental influences, and can manifest themselves in the worst forms if they are not confronted. The incident was an important reminder that combating bias and aggression requires a sustained effort by schools, families, and society as a whole. Teachers and parents realized that their personal example and attention to children's moral values were crucial. Families faced with the consequences of the incident realized that education does not begin in the classroom, but at home, in discussions around the dinner table, and in the minutiae of everyday life. Teenagers saw, albeit painfully, that their actions have consequences, and cruelty can lead not only to punishment, but also to the destruction of others' fates and their own futures. For James Henderson, the experience left deep wounds, but he believed it was not all in vain. Perhaps his story was the impetus that made people think seriously about the importance of humanity and justice in school and beyond. The education system was forced to realize that fostering empathy and critical thinking is just as important as academic knowledge. This story reminded us that school is not just a place to learn, but also a space where values that shape the future of society are laid down. This case was an important lesson for everyone. Violence and hatred are never without consequences. Only respect, understanding, and a willingness to accept and support each other can create a world where everyone, teacher or student, feels safe and can realize their best qualities. Friends, this story raises a lot of questions and emotions, and we would be glad to hear your opinion. What do you think about what happened? Have you had any situations in your life involving prejudice or injustice? Please share your thoughts and stories in the comments. Your experience and your opinion are really important to us. We appreciate each and every one of you, and your support helps us promote our channel and share important stories with even more people. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and click the bell so you don't miss new videos. Thank you for being with us. We wish you a great day filled with respect and kindness.